Okay, so the aim of this video is to look at the source comparison question from OCR AS history on America 1865 to 1920 as the AS part of that. What we're looking to do is to see two extracts here from the specimen paper, and we're looking to answer this question with reference to these extracts and your understanding of historical context. Which of these provides the more convincing interpretation of the rise of American power in the early 20th century? Now, at this stage we're still learning a little bit. It's the first year of the course, not sure exactly how it should go, but I've provided a few ideas in here to answer this. It's from the specimen paper. I've used some of the mark schemes, some of my own ideas as well, to try and put together a bit of a structure, a bit of a plan for you. So let's have a look. So this is from the mark scheme. In response to this question, students may choose to respond to each extract in turn, or to adopt a more comparative approach of individual arguments. Either approach could be equally valid. I think that's an important point for us there. Either approach could be equally valid, and I think personally I'd be tempted to look at one's extract. Why is it useful? Why is it not? Why is it more convincing? Why is it not? And then the other extract to follow. I think that's a bit more straightforward, but obviously you can see both approaches are there. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. Okay, so what I've done here is I've taken out the top three levels of the mark scheme, obviously out of 25 marks this question. And I think I've tried to highlight the themes that are running through it, okay? So the understanding of the interpretation given in the extracts, all right? And that's really important. Do you understand what they're trying to say and how they've put it together, okay? And the bottom bomb, good understanding of context. I think that's the key, and almost if you've got that good understanding of context and you can reevaluate, you're going to be in a really strong position with this, okay? Because if you know what they're talking about and you can use your own knowledge, your own context, and apply it to the question, then you're going to do well. Yes, in order to provide a well-substantiated judgment of a more convincing interpretation. That's obviously the aim of this. In the textbook we've got, it says, like, don't just write about the topic. Make sure that you directly focus on the two sources that are there. I'd agree with that as well. Nice and tight focus on the question throughout is obviously important as well for the purple. And obviously the reddish target there comes through, shines through really in the orange and in the purple as well. Okay, so make sure you're doing all those things when you're writing this, okay, and obviously we'll get it placed on those levels. Okay, so looking at extract A then, alright, now then, what I've done is I've highlighted parts of the extract that I want to discuss. Now obviously this is to give you a bit of a plan, but I think in the exam it would be good, the extracts are usually in the middle of the page, to sort of maybe be annotating those, writing on one side, writing on the other side, reasons why you would think they are convincing, why they aren't, okay, and that's what the colours represent here. So the first bit, under President Theodore Roosevelt, that the imperialist greatness of the United States was most effectively trumpeted. Okay, and I think as you can see over here, what I've done is I've highlighted that last part, most effectively trumpeted. But I've kind of contradicted that to start off with, because in 1898 the Treaty of Paris allowed America to purchase the Philippines. Many Americans thought the reason for doing that was a few reasons, but one of them was to civilize the islanders, make them Christian and make them more American. And that does sound very similar to what Roosevelt was trying to do. Okay, but there was quite a backlash against the annexation of the Philippines by Americans. The Anti-Imperialist League, that perhaps is the article saying, is the extract saying that this has changed a little bit by the time that Roosevelt comes into presidency. Has he been able to manipulate that a little bit? That's certainly the impression given in the extract, although we do know also that there was still some reticence to this, and on the mark scheme it talks about the First World War, which obviously comes much later than this, and the fact that there was still reticence there from American people to get involved in the conflict. So that perhaps shows that hadn't changed. Okay, if we move on to the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, supervision over all of the Americas by the United States, and that's a key word from the extract. Okay, and as I've put here, Roosevelt talked about America acting as an international police power, and that came directly from the Roosevelt Corollary. It reflects a turning point in American policy as Roosevelt transformed the Monroe Doctrine from a defensive idea into an expansionist one. America imposed a new political system on Cuba in 1903. Even though America had invaded the island in 1948, obviously before Roosevelt, America became much more involved in how Cuba was run, with things like the Platt Amendment. which limited Cuba's sovereignty and gave the USA the right to intervene in Cuba affairs and naval bases in Cuba. So again, that shows that perhaps why the author has mentioned that element to it there. And finally, under Roosevelt, the United States was one of the great powers of the world. And I think if you look at Roosevelt's actions in Japan, in Cuba and in Japan, you can really see that why he said that. Okay, certainly America is no longer just focusing on itself, which focuses on areas like Japan outside of the Monroe Doctrine. But that said, the strategic economic outpost in the Pacific makes me instantly think of Hawaii. It was annexed under McKinley in 1898. So the fact that it says that there, I understand that there were other strategic economic outposts in the Pacific, but I think to mention that, well, actually, I'm not so sure it is that convincing, because perhaps it makes you think of Hawaii, which is obviously taken under McKinley before. So I'm hoping what you can see here is that I've taken elements of the extract and I've tried to show why I do think they are convincing and why I don't think they are convincing. That's reflected in the colours. And it might be good if you sort of had the extract in the middle of the page like that, and then you had kind of on one side you had the kind of positive things, the things that make it convincing, and on the other side you kind of had the negatives, so that while you're working your way through it, you can be adding details in as you go and effectively be producing a plan at the same time. Okay, so we want to extract B then, 30 years later. And it's a funny one in a sense, because it starts off with this blue quote up here that I'm talking about. Okay, the blue quote, I've brought it across here. Was the first president of the United States to play a role as a world statesman. He was a world statesman, and his college showed that he looked to increase American involvement, build on the Monroe Doctrine. But it seems a bit strong, especially when you consider both the rest of the source and the role of McKinley in the Spanish-American War. The rest of the source goes on to suggest that actually Roosevelt's perhaps not, actually almost disagrees with what's here, actually disagrees with what's at the top. So let's move on and think about this. Yes, the purple one then, and he's talking about limitations there. And it reflects the view that Roosevelt's achievements were more image than reality. It reflects the view that there were more powerful constraints on American imperialism, both in military strength and public opinion. Now, what I've done is I've taken that straight from the mark scheme, but I do feel, as I've put in red there, it feels a little bit too one-sided considering some of Roosevelt's achievements, and it might be worth dropping those in there. We haven't mentioned them obviously on the other extracts. You can put some of those in. And then his greatest achievement was to act as a mediator between the Japanese and Russians and to host a peace conference at Portsmouth. But it underrates America's position in the world, giving only the Treaty of Portsmouth a significant achievement and ignores many others. Again, that's straight from the mark scheme. So you can see that by picking one of them as his greatest achievements and not mentioning any others, perhaps it's a bit too one-sided. And again, the blue box there in this phrase, a typically ostentatious gesture, indicates an anti-Roosevelt bias and can be disputed. He was a shrewd politician who worked hard to achieve his aims. It was not all show. So again, I do what I suggested last time. Okay, you have the source in the middle of the, and you'd have kind of on one side the reasons why it is convincing, and on the other side the reasons why it isn't. Obviously, I set it out like this to give you a bit of a better idea, but you can see what I'm talking about there. And then you should be in a position to write both of these. Okay. Okay, so having written then about both extracts, what I would do before you look at your conclusion is I would just look back and see how tightly you've focused on that phrase convincing. Okay, and just make sure you've written a paragraph, a couple of paragraphs about extract A, why it's convincing, why it's not. Extract B, why it's convincing and why it's not. Before you get on to your conclusion, I would just check that word. Have you actually been writing about that? And just tighten up your language if you haven't. And then move on to conclusion, which strangely in the specimen paper mark scheme hasn't got a conclusion. So I've obviously brought a few ideas. And I think that both extracts tend to exaggerate their points. Extract A looks to exaggerate the importance of Roosevelt, whereas extract B looks to provide the opposite view. And maybe a more nuanced extract, taken in both sides, might be more convincing, that actually Roosevelt did do a lot to be this world statesman and make America a great power that we talked about. However, it wasn't completely successful, and elements of it maybe were more for show than others. Perhaps that kind of thing. If we look specifically at extract A, under Roosevelt, the United States was one of the greatest powers of the world. That's hard to dispute. And I think that extract B seems to go too far in presenting Roosevelt's achievements as image rather than reality. So I've had a few ideas up there. Okay. So I think that's the kind of the structure that we should have. Okay, both sides for each one about how convincing they are, and then a conclusion at the bottom. And it might be that you choose to write maybe 5 paragraphs, a paragraph why extract A is convincing and why it's not, or it might be that you decide to work through each of the extracts and just say picking out the elements and saying both sides for each one, whichever one you feel suits you best. But I think the key phrases is that tightness and focus on the question.